Hey guys, tonight we're going to step back in time, way back to the shimmering, sun-baked dust of the Roman Empire. Imagine the heat, the bustling markets, the faint scent of olive oil, and something vaguely unwashed carried on the breeze. You're there, feeling the grit underfoot. Perhaps a stray chicken squawks nearby, and the murmur of Latin and Greek fills the air. It's a world both utterly alien and strangely familiar. A place where fortunes were made and lost, and where one young man, propelled by forces beyond his control, would rise to become an emperor so peculiar, so utterly devoted to a single luxurious fabric that he'd forever be known for it. You probably won't survive this level of historical minutiae without at least a mild sense of drowsiness setting in. And honestly, that's the point. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story begins not in the marble halls of Rome, but far to the east, in a place called Emesa, modern-day Homs, in Syria. It's the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries AD, and the Roman Empire, though vast and powerful, is starting to feel the strain of its own enormity. You're picturing legions, right? Triumphant arches, toga-clad senators. Well, put that thought on pause for a moment. We're in a bustling provincial city, a crossroads of cultures and trade, and the air is thick with the scent of spices and incense. Here in Emesa stands the grand temple of Elagabalus, a local sun god revered with a passion that Rome, with its more staid pantheon, could barely comprehend. This isn't just any temple. It's the spiritual heart of the city, and its high priest holds immense local power and prestige. Our protagonist, if we can call him that, is a young boy named Varius Avitus Bassianus. Sounds suitably Roman, doesn't it? But here's the twist. He's not really Roman in the way you might think. His family, the Masani, were a prominent aristocratic clan deeply entrenched in the religious life of the city. His mother, Julia Soaemius, was a niece of the Empress Julia Dumna, the formidable wife of Emperor Septimius Severus. This connection, though seemingly distant, would prove to be his golden ticket, or perhaps his silken snare. Young Varius, from an early age, was destined for the priesthood of Elagabalus. You can imagine him, a boy perhaps no older than 10 or 12, already adorned in the ceremonial robes of the temple, his days filled with rituals, incantations, and the solemn duty of serving his god. It's a far cry from the playground antics most kids were up to, isn't it? No wonder he developed some idiosyncrasies. The Severan dynasty, currently on the throne, was experiencing its own tumultuous period. The emperor, Caracalla Septimius, Severus's son, was a notoriously brutal and paranoid ruler. He had recently murdered his own brother, Geta, in their mother's arms. A real family man, that Caracalla. This act, among countless others, had alienated many, and the empire was simmering with discontent. In 217 AD, Caracalla was assassinated during a campaign in Mesopotamia, leaving the empire leaderless. The Praetorian prefect Macronus quickly seized power, proclaiming himself emperor. Now Macronus was a good administrator, a solid military man, but he lacked one crucial thing in Roman politics: dynastic legitimacy. He wasn't from an old, venerable family, and the Severan loyalists, particularly the influential women of the imperial household, saw him as an upstart. This is where the Emerson connection becomes vital. Julia Misa, Julia Domna's sister, and Varius's grandmother, was a woman of formidable ambition and cunning. Exiled to Emesa by Macrinus, she saw an opportunity in her grandson. The propaganda machine, even back then, was surprisingly sophisticated. Julia Misa began to spread rumors that Varius Aetius Bassianus was, in fact, the illegitimate son of the recently murdered Emperor Caracalla. Think of it, a direct link to the revered Severan line, a claim to legitimacy that Macrinus simply couldn't counter. It was a brilliant, audacious move. The story, of course, was almost certainly fabricated. Caracalla wasn't known for his dalliances in Emesa, and the timeline didn't quite add up. But in the chaos of a power vacuum, a good story is often more powerful than the truth. Historians still argue whether Julia Misa genuinely believed her own fiction, or if it was a cold, calculated power grab from the start. Perhaps a bit of both, a convenient belief. The legionaries stationed in Syria, many of whom had been loyal to Caracalla and harbored resentment towards Macrinus, were receptive to this narrative. They missed the prestige and pay that came with a truly imperial family, and Macrinus was seen as stingy and uncharismatic. Imagine these grizzled soldiers, far from home, grumbling about their new boss, and then suddenly, a glimmer of hope appears. A young, charismatic priest, supposedly the son of their former, albeit brutal, emperor. The cult of Elagabalus itself played a huge role here. The god was a powerful, almost mystical figure, and his young priest was seen as divinely touched. This religious fervor, combined with clever political maneuvering, began to sway the legions. On May 16th to 18 AD, just a little over a year after Caracalla's death, the unthinkable happened. In a dramatic coup orchestrated by Julia Misa and Julia Soamias, the 3rd Legion Gallica, stationed near Emesa, proclaimed Varius Aviatus Bassianus as emperor. He was, at this point, perhaps only 14 years old. Can you imagine? One day you're performing rituals to a sun god. The next, you're suddenly the most powerful man in the known world, a teenage emperor in waiting. It's enough to make anyone's head spin and perhaps lose a little touch with reality. He took the regnal name Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Augustus, a conscious attempt to associate himself with the revered philosopher emperor Marcus Aurelius and the Antonine dynasty. But he quickly became known by the name of his god, Elagabalus, a name that, for centuries, would evoke both fascination and revulsion. Macrinus, caught off guard, tried to rally his forces. A series of skirmishes ensued, culminating in the decisive Battle of Antioch on June 8th to 18 AD. The legions, loyal to Elagabalus, fueled by religious fervor and the promise of a glorious new reign, utterly routed Macrinus's army. Macrinus himself attempted to flee, disguised as a postal worker, because, when in doubt, deliver the mail. But he was captured and executed. His young son and compeer, Diademenian, met a similar fate. And just like that, the Severan women had reclaimed the throne, placing their young, impressionable puppet, Elagabalus, firmly in control. Or so they thought. The empire held its breath. A new emperor, so young, so steeped in an exotic Eastern cult, was a novelty, to say the least. The Senate in Rome, ever the sycophants, swiftly ratified his appointment, eager to demonstrate their loyalty to the new power. You can almost hear the collective sigh of relief, followed by a nervous whisper, "What now?" Little did they know, this young boy, thrust into power, would bring with him not just a new god, but a whole new approach to imperial dress, one that would scandalize Rome and cement his peculiar place in history. His early life, a blend of priestly duties and sheltered privilege, had hardly prepared him for the political snake pit that was the Roman court. He had known only the rituals of Emesa, the incense, the elaborate vestments, and the singular devotion to his sun god. This narrow upbringing, combined with his youth and sudden, unchecked power, would prove to be a volatile cocktail. He arrived on the scene as a blank slate, upon which his powerful grandmother and mother hoped to write their own script for the future of the Roman Empire. But young Elagabalus, it would soon become clear, had a very different script in mind, one woven entirely from silk. With Macrinus dispatched and the empire's gaze now fixed firmly eastward, young Elagabalus, the boy priest from Emesa, began his slow, deliberate journey to Rome. This wasn't a hurried dash. It was a grand procession, a deliberate, theatrical spectacle designed to introduce the new emperor and his divine patron to the Roman world. You can imagine the scene, miles of dusty roads stretching across Asia Minor and eventually into Europe, lined with curious onlookers, soldiers, standard-bearers, retainers, servants, vast baggage trains, all moving at the pace of a young emperor, who, for the first time in his life, was truly tasting the intoxicating essence of absolute power. But this wasn't just any imperial progress. Elagabalus brought with him not only his entourage, but also the very embodiment of his god, a large, conical black stone said to have fallen from the heavens. This meteorite, the beetle of Elagabal, was the ultimate symbol of his divine connection. You're picturing a sacred object, maybe encased in gold. Try something a bit more rustic. It was essentially a large, dark rock, somewhat unremarkable to the untrained eye, but imbued with immense spiritual significance for its devotees. This stone, the very heart of the Emesan cult, was carried in a chariot, often pulled not by horses, but by white horses, a symbol of purity and divinity, and sometimes even by the emperor himself, walking backward, facing his god, guiding the reins. Talk about dedication. This wasn't just transporting a religious artifact. It was a public declaration of his divine mandate, a visual sermon preached on the long road to Rome as the procession snaked its way westward. Word of the young emperor's eccentricities began to precede him. Whispers, then murmurs, then outright gossip would have rippled through the towns and cities along his route. "Have you heard?" One merchant might have said to another. "The new emperor. He worships a stone, and he wears the strangest clothes." This early foreshadowing of his unconventional nature set the stage for his arrival in the capital. The Roman populace, accustomed to emperors who at least feigned adherence to traditional Roman values and deities, was about to receive a culture shock of epic proportions. The journey itself took nearly a year. Think of the logistics: feeding thousands of people, providing water, finding suitable overnight stops. It was an organizational feat in itself. Along the way, Elagabalus would have held audiences, received delegations, and undoubtedly continued his religious observances. Each stop would have been an opportunity for him to display his devotion to Elagabalus, to further cement his image as a divinely chosen ruler, not just a usurper's son. He was effectively campaigning, not with speeches, but with spectacle and piety. Finally, in the summer of 219 AD, the grand procession reached the outskirts of Rome. Imagine the anticipation in the city. The Praetorian Guard, the Senate, the common citizens, all waiting to see this boy emperor who had emerged from the eastern provinces, seemingly out of nowhere, to claim the purple. The air would have crackled with a mixture of excitement, apprehension, and perhaps a touch of skepticism. Rome had seen many emperors come and go, but none quite like this. His entrance into Rome was nothing short of a theatrical masterpiece designed to shock and awe. Forget the traditional triumphant general, riding in a chariot pulled by 4 white horses, covered in laurel wreaths. Elagabalus chose a different, far more personal, and deeply symbolic approach. He entered the city not just as emperor, but as the high priest of Elagabalus. The sacred black stone, his god, was placed on a magnificent chariot, richly adorned with gold and jewels, and Elagabalus himself, not riding in the chariot, but walking before it, facing backward, guiding the horses, his eyes fixed on the sacred stone. This was an unprecedented display for a Roman emperor. The very act of guiding the chariot while facing his god underscored his priestly role, elevating the deity above even the imperial personage. It was a visual declaration that Elagabalus was not just a god, but the god, and Elagabalus was his humble servant, despite being the most powerful man in the world. And then there were the clothes. Ah, the clothes. This is where our story truly begins to shimmer. Roman emperors, while certainly dressing well, generally adhered to a certain decorum. The toga was the symbol of Roman citizenship, dignity, and tradition. Generals wore military cloaks, senators wore togas with purple stripes, practical, dignified, and rooted in centuries of custom. Elagabalus, however, had no interest in Roman sartorial traditions. He arrived not in the imperial purple, nor the dignified toga, but in the exotic, flowing robes of his Syrian priesthood. These garments were not merely different, they were vibrant, multicolored, and heavily adorned. They were, in short, silk, and not just any silk, but the finest, most shimmering, most impossibly luxurious silk that could be imported from the distant East. The impact on the Roman populace would have been immediate and profound. You're standing there, in the crowd, straining to catch a glimpse of your new ruler, and what you see isn't the stern military figure you expected, nor the dignified, senatorial type. Instead, you see a slender, almost effeminate youth. His face possibly made up another shock, his hair elaborately styled, and his body draped in fabric that seemed to catch the light and ripple with every movement. It was a fabric so rare, so expensive, that most Romans had only heard whispers of it. Silk. With the decadent East, it was not, by any stretch of the imagination, the attire of a Roman emperor. This initial public display of his unique fashion sense wasn't just a personal preference. It was a deliberate statement. It signaled that Elagabalus was not going to conform to Roman expectations. He was bringing his god, his culture, and his lavish aesthetic to Rome, and Rome, whether it liked it or not, would have to adapt. It was a slap in the face to tradition, a challenge to the established order. The Roman elite, particularly the stern, conservative senators, would have been appalled. What is this? You can almost hear them grumbling in the forum. A priest king from Syria, dressed like a Persian courtesan. The cultural clash was palpable, woven into the very fabric of his garments. His initial actions, upon entering the city, further solidified this perception. Instead of immediately attending to matters of state, Elagabalus prioritized the establishment of his god's cult. He ordered the sacred black stone to be brought into the most venerable temple in Rome, the Temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, on the Capitoline Hill. This was an affront of epic proportions. Jupiter, the king of the gods, the very embodiment of Roman power and piety, was suddenly being asked to share his sacred space with a foreign conical rock. Imagine if, say, the British monarch decided to place a new foreign idol on the altar of Westminster Abbey. That's the kind of sacrilege this felt like too many Romans. This act was swiftly followed by the construction of a new massive temple dedicated solely to Elagabal. It was to be called the Elagabalium, located on the Palatine Hill, one of the most prominent and historically significant locations in Rome. This wasn't just a place of worship. It was a monumental declaration of his god's supremacy, a constant physical reminder visible from much of the city. He wasted no time, no expense. Resources were diverted, skilled laborers were pressed into service, all to construct a fitting home for the sun god. The Senate, though outwardly compliant, must have been simmering. They had just overthrown one emperor, only to find themselves with another who seemed intent on dismantling their traditions from the inside out, starting with their gods and their sartorial standards. His initial acts were not those of a shrewd political operator trying to win over his new subjects, but of a fervent religious devotee imposing his beliefs and tastes with the unshakable conviction of youth and divine appointment. Historians still argue whether his devotion to Elagabalus was genuine, almost childlike faith, or a calculated means to consolidate power, a way to establish a unique, unchallengeable authority based on religious mysticism. Perhaps it was a potent, dangerous mix of both. This controversial entrance, the introduction of the black stone, and the immediate focus on his god set the tone for Elagabalus's entire reign. It announced, unequivocally, that this was an emperor unlike any Rome had ever seen, and the most visible, tangible manifestation of this difference, aside from the sacred meteorite, was the material he chose for his clothing. He wasn't just wearing silk, he was embodying it, making it a central, almost defiant part of his imperial identity. The fabric itself became a symbol of his rule, exotic, costly, fluid, and utterly alien to the Stoic, traditional image of a Roman emperor. The stage was set, the audience was bewildered, and the curtain was about to rise on an imperial reign woven entirely from the threads of extravagance. With Elagabalus firmly ensconced in Rome, the city, and indeed the entire empire, began to truly grasp the seismic shift that had occurred. The initial shock of his entrance slowly gave way to a grudging acceptance, but beneath the surface, a deep unease began to fester. At the heart of this unease was the new emperor's unwavering devotion to his sun god, Elagabal, and his immediate, relentless drive to establish this deity as the supreme god of the Roman pantheon. This wasn't merely adding another god to Rome's already crowded roster. It was an attempt to dismantle the very foundation of Roman religious identity. a foundation built on centuries of tradition and a pantheon of familiar deities. The construction of the Elagabalus on the Palatine Hill was the most tangible manifestation of this radical religious agenda. You're imagining a construction site, right? The din of hammers, the shouts of workmen, the organized chaos of a major building project. This was no mere shrine. It was designed to be the grandest temple in Rome, overshadowing even the venerable temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus. Imagine the sheer audacity of it, tearing down existing structures, clearing land on one of Rome's most sacred hills, all to erect a temple for a foreign god embodied by a black stone. This was not just an architectural project, it was a statement of theological supremacy. The temple itself was a marvel of extravagance. Contemporary accounts, though often biased, describe it as being incredibly lavish, adorned with precious metals and exotic materials. Elagabalus spared no expense. The black stone, the beetle, was to be the centerpiece, housed within an inner sanctuary. But his ambition didn't stop at constructing a magnificent edifice. He sought to integrate, or rather subordinate, the traditional Roman gods into the cult of Elagabalus. This wasn't a syncretic blend, it was a hostile takeover. Perhaps the most scandalous aspect for many Romans was Elagabalus's attempt to marry off his god. Yes, you heard that right. He decreed that Elagabalus, the sun god, needed a consort. And who did he choose? None other than the venerable Vestal Virgin, Aquilia Severa. The Vestal Virgins were the epitome of Roman piety and purity, sworn to chastity for decades, their lives dedicated to tending the sacred flame of Vesta, the goddess of the hearth. To force one of them into a symbolic marriage with a foreign god and a male emperor, no less, was an unparalleled sacrilege. It was a calculated move designed to inextricably link his god with the very fabric of Roman religion, to absorb its power and prestige. You can almost hear the collective gasp of horror from the more traditional Romans. This wasn't just bizarre. It was deeply offensive, a profound violation of their most sacred institutions. Later, seemingly unsatisfied with Aquilia Severa, Elagabalus then had Elagabal marry Urania, or Astarte, a Carthaginian moon goddess. This showed a pattern. First, an attempt to subjugate Rome's own sacred institutions, and then, perhaps, realizing the depth of the resistance, a move to unite his sun god with another prominent Near Eastern deity, forming a more expansive, pan-Eastern religious supremacy. It was a theological expansion, mirroring the empire's own geographical reach, but conducted with a zeal and disregard for local custom that was breathtaking. Historians still argue whether these divine marriages were born of genuine, if misguided, religious fervor, or were simply a manipulative attempt to gain political legitimacy by co-opting existing religious frameworks. It's a puzzle, isn't it? Was he a true believer or a master manipulator in priestly robes? Daily rituals at the Elagabalus were equally shocking to Roman sensibilities. Elagabalus, as the high priest, personally presided over elaborate ceremonies that involved foreign chants, exotic music, and even human sacrifice. According to some ancient sources, though, this particular claim is highly debated and often seen as propaganda from his detractors. While the Romans certainly practiced animal sacrifice, the idea of human sacrifice, particularly by their own emperor, was abhorrent. Whether true or embellished, the rumors alone would have spread like wildfire, painting a picture of a barbaric, un-Roman cult at the heart of the capital. Imagine you're a Roman citizen walking past the Elagabalus during one of these ceremonies. You might catch a glimpse of the emperor himself, not in a toga, but in his shimmering silk robes, leading a procession. Perhaps you'd hear strange, un-Roman music, the clash of cymbals, or the low thrum of drums. Instead of the stately hymns to Jupiter, the air would be thick with exotic incense, unfamiliar to the Roman nose, and the sight of the sacred black stone, often adorned with gold and jewels, would certainly be jarring. It was a sensory assault on Roman tradition, a constant reminder of the alien presence now dominating their spiritual landscape. This religious revolution was intrinsically linked to Elagabalus's personal style. The silk garments he so famously wore were not just fashion statements, they were the vestments of his priesthood. He was, in his own mind, inseparable from his God. His clothing was a visible manifestation of his divine connection, a constant reminder of his unique status as the sun god's earthly representative. When he donned those flowing silk robes, he wasn't just getting dressed, he was performing a ritual. The very act of wearing silk, a material deemed soft, luxurious, and foreign, underscored his Eastern origins and his rejection of rigid Roman masculinity and stoicism. This commitment to the cult permeated every aspect of his reign. He would reportedly force senators and high-ranking officials to participate in his religious ceremonies, even if they found them offensive or bewildering. This wasn't a choice, it was a command from the emperor. You'd be standing there, a stern Roman senator, perhaps a grizzled general, used to the strict decorum of state religion, and suddenly you're expected to dance or chant or offer prayers to a conical stone, all while the teenage emperor, shimmering in silk, watches your every move. It was humiliating, an intentional undermining of their dignity and authority. This aggressive promotion of Elagabalus' cult also had significant financial implications. The construction of the Elagabalus, the lavish ceremonies, the constant acquisition of exotic goods for offerings and adornment, all of this cost an enormous amount of money. The imperial treasury, already strained, would have felt the pressure. This was not a fiscally conservative emperor. He spent money not on roads or aqueducts or the legions, but on the glorification of his deity and, by extension, himself. This further alienated elements of the Roman population and the military, who preferred to see imperial funds spent on more practical matters or on their own welfare. The very scale of the Elagabalus was meant to convey power and permanence. It was a rival to the capital, a new center of religious gravity in Rome, and in many ways it was successful in being audacious. For a brief period, the black stone of Emesa overshadowed the ancient gods of Rome. But this ambition, this single-minded obsession, created a deep rift between the emperor and the Roman establishment. They saw him not as a pious ruler, but as a misguided youth, obsessed with a foreign deity and alien customs. His personal appearance, constantly draped in shimmering silk, became the most potent symbol of this perceived degeneracy. It was a soft, flowing challenge to the hard, unyielding traditions of Rome. And as we'll see, the Roman establishment, slow to anger but implacable once roused, would not tolerate such a radical departure from their ancient ways for long. The very temple he poured so much into would, in time, become a monument to his folly rather than his triumph. As the dust settled, or perhaps as the silk shimmered, the initial shock of Elagabalus's arrival gave way to a deeper, more insidious form of scandal, his daily life, and specifically his wardrobe. You see, the young emperor didn't just wear silk for ceremonial occasions or grand processions. Oh no, Elagabalus wore silk all the time, every day, for everything. It wasn't a costume, it was his skin. And in Rome, this was, to put it mildly, revolutionary, audacious, and utterly scandalous. The Roman concept of appropriate dress was rigid, particularly for men of high status. The toga, as you recall, was the mark of a citizen, dignified and formal. Military leaders wore the paludamentum, a simple cloak. Even the imperial purple, reserved for the emperor, was traditionally a stripe or a full cloak over more conventional attire. It was about gravitas, about practicality, about projecting an image of sober authority. Silk, on the other hand, was everything the Romans were not. It was soft, flowing, effeminate. It clung to the body in ways Roman wool or linen never would. It was delicate, requiring careful handling, a stark contrast to the rough-and-tumble reality of a military empire. It was imported, expensive, and associated with the exotic East, a region Rome viewed with a mixture of fascination and disdain. Elagabalus, however, embraced it with the fervor of a true convert. He wasn't just fond of silk, he was obsessed. Ancient sources, though often exaggerated, paint a vivid picture of an emperor who would never wear the same silk garment twice. Imagine that for a moment. You're having breakfast, then heading to a meeting, then perhaps a brief visit to the baths, and for each activity, a new, fresh silk outfit. This wasn't just about fashion. It was about an unprecedented level of luxury and a defiant rejection of all Roman norms. Consider the sheer logistics of this obsession. Silk, in the 3rd century AD, was not easily come by. Originated primarily in China, a land so distant it was almost mythical to the Romans, reached via the perilous Silk Road. Think camels laden with bales, merchants facing bandits, deserts, and mountains. It was one of the most valuable commodities in the ancient world, traded ounce for ounce, almost like gold. A single silk garment would have cost a fortune. For an emperor to demand new silk outfits daily, perhaps even multiple times a day, meant an astronomical expenditure and an endless supply chain. The imperial treasury must have groaned under the weight of his sartorial demands. One of his biographers, Cassius Dio, marvels at his extravagance, noting that Elagabalus never wore the same clothes twice, but always put on fresh ones, even when he was going to dine. His preferred style was clearly inspired by his Amazon priesthood, long, flowing robes, often richly embroidered, dyed in vibrant, unusual colors. Think shimmering greens, deep blues, startling reds, all glinting under the Roman sun. He would accessorize these with jewels, elaborate headwear, and presumably a lot of very expensive perfume. He was, in essence, a living, breathing advertisement for the exotic East, a walking contradiction to the very idea of Roman imperial masculinity. The reaction from the traditional Roman elite was one of utter disgust. The senators, the equites, knights, the conservative families, his effeminacy, and his utter unsuitability for rule. Roman men were supposed to be virile, stoic, disciplined. Elagabalus, swathed in flowing silk, with his carefully arranged hair and painted eyes, another alleged offense, seemed to embody the antithesis of these virtues. He was everything they considered un-Roman. His choice of attire wasn't just superficial, it was deeply symbolic. By consistently choosing silk over wool or linen, he was implicitly rejecting Roman values. He was signaling that his loyalties lay elsewhere, with his foreign god and his Eastern heritage. It was a visual barrier he erected between himself and the very people he ruled. Imagine a modern head of state consistently appearing in public in elaborate, outlandish costumes, totally unrelated to their national dress code. It would spark outrage, wouldn't it? Elagabalus was doing just that, but on an imperial scale, with the added layer of religious and cultural defiance. This obsession wasn't just about public display. It extended to his private life. His palaces, too, were reportedly adorned with silk hangings, silk cushions, silk covers for his couches. It was a total immersion in the fabric, a silken cocoon. He bathed in perfumed oils, often in baths filled with rose petals, another extravagant touch. Good luck cleaning that up. And then, naturally, donned a fresh set of silk garments. Every detail, every moment, was an opportunity for opulent display. Even his footwear was reportedly silk embroidered, or perhaps made from the finest, softest leathers. He certainly wasn't tramping around in rough military boots. This attention to every element of his personal presentation further highlighted his nonconformist attitude. He wasn't just wearing silk shirts, he was wearing silk everything. One anecdote, possibly apocryphal but illustrative of his image, claimed he would only allow his floors to be strewn with gold dust or powdered amber, and then silk cushions for him to walk upon. Well, probably an exaggeration, it captures the essence of his reputation for extreme, almost childish opulence. This lavishness extended beyond himself to his companions. He surrounded himself with a coterie of favorites, often young men or attractive commoners, who were likewise indulged in silks and luxuries. This circle of friends, equally clad in exotic finery, further alienated the traditional Roman aristocracy, who saw their own influence waning in favor of these newcomers. Who are these people? They would have muttered. Why do they dress like that? The sheer scale of his demand for silk also had an economic impact. It would have driven up prices, making an already expensive commodity even more prohibitive for anyone else. While the Roman economy was vast, such singular imperial demands could certainly distort markets and drain resources. Think of the enormous number of skilled weavers, tailors, dyers, and merchants who would have been involved in satisfying this one emperor's insatiable desire for fresh silk. It was an industry built around one man's obsession, but perhaps the most profound effect of his silk wardrobe was its constant visual challenge to Roman notions of gender and power. In Rome, softness and excessive adornment were associated with women or with decadent, effeminate men. A truly masculine Roman man was rugged, disciplined, and modest in his dress. Elagabalus, by flouting these norms, deliberately blurred the lines. This wasn't just a fashion faux pas. It was a perceived attack on the very foundations of Roman society and its patriarchal structure. He was seen as undermining the very concept of what it meant to be a Roman man, let alone a Roman emperor. Historians still debate the extent to which Elagabalus's effeminacy was genuine or a deliberate political statement, a way to further differentiate himself from traditional Roman emperors and align himself more closely with his exotic deity. Was he simply a young man with unusual tastes, or was he intentionally trying to dismantle Roman masculinity as a form of cultural warfare? The truth, as always, is probably somewhere in the middle, a complex interplay of personal inclination, religious devotion, and a defiant adolescent desire to shock. What is undeniable is that his silk habit became an indelible part of his public image, a shimmering, rustling symbol of his controversial reign, setting the stage for the inevitable clashes with a Roman establishment that valued tradition and gravitas above all else. His silks weren't just clothes. They were a declaration of war on Roman cultural sensibilities. The problem with being an emperor who only wears silk, especially when that emperor is a teenager, is that your daily routine becomes less about governing and more about performing. For Elagabalus, life in the imperial palace was not a somber affair of statecraft and weighty decisions, but a constant, elaborate pageant, meticulously choreographed around his personal indulgences and, of course, his omnipresent silk wardrobe. You might imagine the day of a Roman emperor being filled with dry legal matters, military briefings, and formal addresses. For Elagabalus, think more along the lines of a reality show, but with more incense and far, far more expensive fabric. Let's begin at the very start of his day. Waking up in the imperial cubiculum, probably on a bed piled high with silk cushions and drapes. His morning ritual would have been nothing short of an intricate ceremony. Servants, likely a small army of them, would attend to his every need. This wasn't just about personal hygiene. It was about the meticulous preparation of the divine vessel. He would be bathed, perhaps in water, infused with exotic oils, or even, as some sources claim, rose petals. Imagine the poor slaves tasked with cleaning that out. Then came the perfuming, the elaborate styling of his hair, often powdered with gold dust or adorned with precious stones, and, allegedly, the application of cosmetics. Yes, eye makeup and rouge for a Roman emperor, another shocking detail that cemented his reputation for effeminacy. And then the moment of truth, the choosing of the day's silk. This wasn't a quick grab from a closet. His wardrobe must have been vast, a dedicated wing of the palace filled with countless tunics, cloaks, and stoles, all woven from the finest, most vibrant silks imported from the distant east. You can picture racks upon racks, shimmering cascades of color, a king's ransom in fabric. Each garment would have been worn only once before being discarded or, perhaps, given away to favored courtiers, a perk that surely made them overlook some of his quirks. The selection process itself would have been an event, with imperial stylists, or perhaps just his doting mother or grandmother, offering choices, ensuring the color and style suited his mood or the particular deity he wished to honor that day. Once dressed in his chosen, shimmering silk, the public performance truly began. His appearances, whether in the Senate, the Forum, or during religious ceremonies, were always a spectacle. Imagine him gliding through the marble halls of the palace, his robes rustling softly, catching the light, a stark contrast to the more sober wool and linen worn by everyone else. He wasn't just walking, he was making an entrance. Every step was a statement. The visual impact would have been immense, a constant reminder of his exoticism and his un-Roman sensibilities. His daily schedule often revolved around the rituals of his sun god, Elagabalus. He would preside over ceremonies at the Elagabalus, often in his full priestly regalia, which, naturally, was also silk. These ceremonies were designed to be grand, theatrical, and utterly unlike traditional Roman worship. There would be singing, dancing by the emperor himself, a scandal in itself, and foreign music. He reportedly forced senators and high-ranking officials to participate in these rites, even those who found the foreign god abhorrent. Imagine a stern, grizzled general, a veteran of countless campaigns, being coerced into dancing awkwardly while dressed in a borrowed, possibly ill-fitting, silk tunic, all under the watchful, judging eye of a teenage emperor. The humiliation would have been profound. But beyond the religious duties, Elagabalus's daily life was a succession of increasingly bizarre and lavish entertainments. He was reportedly obsessed with sensory pleasures. His meals were legendary for their extravagance. He would serve dishes made from rare and exotic ingredients, camel heels, parrot tongues, flamingo brains, all listed by ancient sources as examples of his culinary excesses. The dining couches would be adorned with silk, the floors strewn with flowers, often so thickly that guests would slip and fall, a subtle practical joke, perhaps. He famously served food dyed different colors, or organized meals based entirely on one color, like an all-green feast. You might think, oh, how quaint, but remember, this was in a time of far less food diversity, and such culinary theatrics were seen as the height of decadence. Even his pets were exotic and pampered. He kept lions and leopards, allegedly tame, enough to be led on leashes through the palace, probably on silk leads, for all we know. Imagine sitting down for dinner and a leopard strolls by. It's certainly a conversation starter. He also reportedly kept a collection of snakes, which he would sometimes release among his unsuspecting guests, causing chaos and panic. A great way to clear a room, if you ask me. These were not the actions of a statesman, but of a bored, powerful child finding amusement in shocking his elders. His nocturnal activities were equally scandalous. He would frequent the taverns and brothels of Rome, often disguised, though one wonders how effective a disguise would be when you're accustomed to wearing nothing but the finest silk. These escapades, rather than being discreet, were apparently quite public, further fueling the rumors and outrage among the Roman elite. An emperor, the embodiment of Roman gravitas, carousing with commoners and prostitutes. It was unthinkable. The silk theme, however, remained central to even these private moments. He reportedly slept on beds filled with rose petals and covered in silk sheets. His favorite companions, often young men or even palace servants, were likewise adorned in silk garments, mimicking his own style. He was creating a silken bubble around himself, a world where the tactile luxury of silk was omnipresent, a constant reminder of his unbridled power and his disdain for Roman frugality. This daily routine centered around personal indulgence, religious ceremony, and a complete disregard for imperial decorum created a deep chasm between Elagabalus and the traditional Roman ruling class. The Senate, the military commanders, and the influential old families watched with growing alarm as their emperor spent his days in what they considered effeminate pursuits, dressed in barbaric silks rather than attending to the serious business of empire. They valued dignitas, dignity, gravitas, seriousness, and pietas, piety, in the Roman sense. Elagabalus embodied none of these. His constant demand for fresh silks also meant that the imperial vestiarum, the imperial wardrobe, would have been a hive of activity. Imagine the vast numbers of laundresses, tailors, and garment custodians constantly at work, ensuring a fresh supply of pristine silk garments for every whim. It was a logistical marvel in itself, entirely dedicated to one man's obsession. This kind of personal indulgence on such a grand scale was unprecedented, and it was certainly not endearing him to the common people who struggled with the daily realities of Roman life. Historians still argue whether Elagabalus was truly depraved, as his biographers portray him, or simply a young, isolated boy with absolute power, acting out a cultural identity that was completely alien to Rome. Was his daily performance a deliberate provocation, a way to dismantle the old order, or simply the natural expression of a personality unconstrained by norms? Whatever the motivation, his daily life, a shimmering tapestry of silk and scandal, cemented his reputation as one of Rome's most unusual and ultimately most reviled emperors. His constant public display of silk was a visible, tactile symbol of his perceived decadence, a persistent affront to Roman modesty and tradition. And in Rome, such affronts rarely went unpunished for long. The very fabric of Elagabalus's reign, literally and figuratively, was silk, and this proved to be a constant point of friction with the very heart of Roman power, the Senate. You see, the Roman Senate wasn't just a talking shop. It was the symbolic guardian of Roman tradition, dignity, and republican ideals, even under the empire. They were the keepers of the flame, the embodiment of Roman gravitas, and they viewed Elagabalus's fashion choices not as a mere eccentricity, but as a direct assault on everything they held dear. Imagine the typical Roman senator. He's probably an older man, a member of an ancient, distinguished family, whose ancestors served the Republic or the early empire with stoic dedication. He wears the toga, perhaps with the broad purple stripe indicating his senatorial rank. His bearing is serious, his demeanor solemn. He values austerity, military prowess, and civic duty. Now, imagine him sitting in the Senate House, marble, cool, beneath him, listening to some mundane pronouncement, and then in walks the emperor, not in the dignified imperial purple, not in the stately toga, but draped in shimmering, multicolored silk. The silk would rustle with every movement, catching the light in a way that wool or linen never could. It was vibrant, almost garish, and utterly alien. This wasn't just a sartorial mismatch. It was a cultural and political declaration. For a Roman senator, silk was associated with effeminacy, with Eastern decadence, with a lack of discipline and moral fiber. It was the fabric of courtesans and foreign potentates, not the leader of the mighty Roman Empire. Every time Elagabalus appeared in silk, it was a silent, continuous insult. It questioned their values, mocked their traditions, and undermined the very image of Roman strength and masculinity. The disdain wasn't subtle. Ancient sources, particularly those written by senators or those sympathetic to the senatorial class, heap scorn upon Elagabalus's wardrobe. They describe him as effeminate, luxurious, and un-Roman, and his silk garments are always front and center in these accusations. They saw his choice of clothing as evidence of his broader moral corruption and his unsuitability to rule. It reinforced their perception that he was a boy, not a man, a priest, not an emperor. Beyond the aesthetics, there was the sheer cost. For a state constantly struggling to finance its legions and maintain its vast infrastructure, the idea of an emperor squandering immense wealth on ephemeral fashion seemed utterly irresponsible. The Senate, which controlled much of the state's finances and was responsible for approving expenditures, would have grumbled constantly about the drain on the treasury caused by his lavish lifestyle, of which his silk habit was a major component. Every new silk tunic was money that could have gone to public works, to military pay, or to alleviating poverty. The senators saw themselves as prudent stewards of the state. Elagabalus, in his silken robes, appeared to be a profligate spendthrift. His refusal to wear the traditional toga was a particularly sore point. The toga was more than just clothing. It was a symbol of Roman identity, of citizenship, of civilization itself. To reject it was to reject Rome. Elagabalus, by consistently favoring his Syrian robes, was essentially telling the Senate and the Roman people that he did not consider himself truly Roman, or that his Roman identity was secondary to his role. As high priest of Elagabalus, this deeply offended those who prided themselves on their Roman heritage and believed in the superiority of Roman customs. Furthermore, Elagabalus didn't just wear silk. He actively tried to make others wear it, or at least endure his presence in it. He would force senators to attend his bizarre religious ceremonies, often dressed in what they considered undignified attire, while he himself would be resplendent in his priestly silks. This was a direct assault on their dignity, a public humiliation. Imagine being a respected elder statesman, forced to participate in a ritual you deemed sacrilegious, all while a teenage emperor shimmered before you in clothes that screamed foreign decadence. It was emasculating, designed to break their spirit and assert his absolute, unconventional authority. The Senate's growing alienation wasn't just about clothing, of course. It was a culmination of his religious fanaticism, his sexual promiscuity. By Roman standards, his bizarre public antics, and his perceived disregard for Roman law and tradition. But the silk was the visible, constant, and inescapable symbol of all these transgressions. It was the physical embodiment of his perceived otherness, a tangible sign of his alien nature. Consider the political implications. The Senate, while nominally subordinate to the emperor, still held immense power through their collective influence, their control over public opinion, and their ability to legitimize or delegitimize a ruler. By consistently offending and alienating them, Elagabalus was undermining his own base of support. He was creating a powerful, influential enemy in the very heart of Rome. They would be the ones whispering in the ears of military commanders, spreading rumors, and quietly plotting his downfall. The lack of mainstream historical facts about positive senatorial interactions with Elagabalus regarding his fashion is telling. There are no accounts of senators praising his bold style or innovative use of fabrics. Instead, the narratives are almost universally condemnatory. This tells us that his silk obsession was not seen as a harmless quirk, but as a serious flaw, symptomatic of a deeper unsuitability for rule. It reinforced the notion that he was not a proper Roman emperor, but a foreign priest king. out of place in their stoic capital. This constant friction also highlights a quirky tidbit. The Roman Senate, despite its power, could often be surprisingly petty. While they dealt with matters of state, they also clearly cared deeply about appearances and social codes. An emperor's wardrobe, which might seem trivial to us, was, for them, a profound statement of character and intent. Elagabalus's silk habit demonstrated not just bad taste, but a fundamental misunderstanding or outright rejection of the Roman system. Historians still argue whether the extreme negative portrayals of Elagabalus in ancient texts are entirely accurate, or if they were heavily influenced by senatorial propaganda designed to justify his overthrow. There is no doubt that his reign was controversial, but the sheer vitriol directed at his person, often focusing on his perceived effeminacy and sexual escapades, suggests a deliberate campaign to blacken his name. His silk wardrobe, so often mentioned, became a shorthand for all his alleged vices. It was a visual cue, a simple way to say, he was not like us. He was a foreign, decadent aberration. In this atmosphere of growing resentment, the silk became a rallying point for discontent. It was the glaring, shimmering sign that this emperor was fundamentally different, fundamentally wrong for Rome, the Senate. Traditionally, the voice of Roman conservatism became the silent, simmering opposition. Their dignity offended, their traditions flouted. They watched, they waited, and they undoubtedly plotted, their disapproval woven into every rustle of the emperor's expensive, un-Roman robes. The threads of his garments became symbolic threads of discontent, slowly but surely tightening around his neck. When you have absolute power, an insatiable appetite for the exotic, and a complete disregard for tradition, your dinner parties tend to be rather ... memorable. For Elagabalus, his feasts were not merely opportunities for dining. They were elaborate, theatrical follies designed to shock, entertain, and sometimes mildly torture his guests. You might have imagined Roman banquets as elegant affairs, perhaps with some poetry and philosophical discussion. Elagabalus took the concept of lavish entertainment and turned it up to 11, then promptly broke the knob off. The stories of his banquets are legendary, often recounted with a mixture of horror and fascination by ancient chroniclers. These were not quiet gatherings. Imagine entering a dining hall draped in shimmering silk, remember? Everything had to be silk, the air thick with the scent of exotic perfumes and rare incense, perhaps even flowers strewn so deeply across the floor that you'd be walking on petals up to your ankles. The lighting would be soft, perhaps from hundreds of oil lamps or carefully placed torches, casting a warm, decadent glow on the scene. The food itself was the stuff of nightmares for a Roman accountant. Elagabalus reportedly served dishes made from the most improbable and expensive ingredients. Think parrot tongues, an entire camel's heel, or even, as one shocking anecdote claims, dishes composed entirely of the brains of peacocks and nightingales. These weren't just rare, they were monumentally difficult to procure and prepare. One mainstream historical fact is that Roman banquets could be quite lavish, but Elagabalus pushed it to an extreme that even his contemporaries found outrageous. He reportedly fed his dogs foie gras and even adorned them with golden collars. Imagine the grumbling amongst the less fortunate citizens of Rome. Beyond the sheer cost, the presentation was designed to astound. He would serve dishes entirely of one color or structure meals around a specific theme. Think of a course made entirely of green vegetables, or perhaps a fish course where every fish was served in a different, unique sauce. He'd even serve food on plates made of gold or silver, or throw solid silver serving dishes out the window into the street below, simply because they had been used once. Why use it again when I can simply acquire new ones? You can almost hear him saying with a shrug, this wasn't generosity, it was a deliberate, arrogant display of wealth and contempt for material value. But the food was often just the beginning of the evening's entertainment. Elagabalus delighted in practical jokes and bizarre surprises. One quirky or fringe tidbit is the infamous flower drop. During a particularly lavish dinner, he once had a mechanism installed in the ceiling that would release vast quantities of flowers, roses, violets, lilies, onto his guests. Sounds pleasant, right? A fragrant, beautiful surprise. Well, not quite. The sheer volume of flowers released was so enormous that several guests reportedly suffocated beneath the suffocating, fragrant mound. Now, this account could be an exaggeration, a sensationalist detail designed to paint him as a cruel tyrant. But the fact that it was even imagined speaks volumes about his reputation. It's the ancient Roman equivalent of throwing a bowling ball at someone's head and calling it a prank. Oh, did that hurt? Just a bit of fun. Another favorite trick was to serve his guests glass versions of delicious foods, or even provide them with inedible dishes made from marble or wood, beautifully crafted to look like real food. Imagine biting into what you think is a perfectly roasted pheasant, only to chip a tooth on a piece of sculpted marble. The emperor, meanwhile, would be feasting on the real thing, probably laughing hysterically at their discomfort. You probably won't survive this, he might have quipped, as someone spat out a mouthful of marble. His banquets were also infamous for their unexpected guest lists. He wasn't just inviting senators and nobles. He would invite random individuals from the streets of Rome, prostitutes, actors, charioteers, even beggars. And he would then shower them with gifts, often incredibly valuable ones, like imperial slaves, or even sums of money equivalent to a senator's annual income. While seemingly a populist move, it deeply offended the Roman aristocracy. They found it demeaning to be forced to dine alongside such commoners, and they resented the emperor's arbitrary generosity to those outside their class. Why is he giving away state wealth to riffraff when I served the Republic for 30 years? The entertainment during these feasts was equally unconventional. He would bring in exotic dancers, foreign musicians playing strange instruments, or even wild animals. One account describes him having tame lions and leopards roam freely amongst the tables during dinner, sending shivers and probably a few screams through the terrified guests. Imagine trying to enjoy your gilded fish when a large, hungry cat is sniffing your leg. No wonder the stress levels were high. His indulgence extended to his personal relationships. He was known for having a series of marriages, often unconventional and scandalous by Roman standards, but also for his many male lovers. He would reportedly bestow vast sums of money, titles, and expensive gifts, including elaborate silk garments, upon his favorites. These relationships further fueled the rumors of his decadence and effeminacy among the conservative Roman elite. The public displays of his follies were not limited to the palace. He would famously parade through Rome in extravagant chariots, often drawn by bizarre combinations of animals, lions, tigers, stags, even elephants, all allegedly harnessed with silk and gold. He would throw coins from his chariot to the crowds, but rather than gold or silver, they were often bronze coins, gilded to look valuable, a cruel jest. Or he would throw real gold coins, but only for a moment, then have his guards retrieve them, leaving the common people scrambling for nothing. He enjoyed watching the chaos he created. One particular anecdote that highlights his penchant for the absurd: he reportedly organized chariot races where the drivers were not professionals, but women of noble birth or even prostitutes. This was an utter inversion of Roman gender roles and public morality. Roman women were generally confined to the domestic sphere. To have them perform in public spectacles was deeply scandalous. Historians still argue whether Elagabalus's seemingly erratic behavior and lavish follies were genuine expressions of a deeply disturbed individual, or if they were a calculated strategy to undermine the traditional Roman elite and impose a new East-centric religious and cultural order. Was he truly mad, or was there a method to his madness, a deliberate attempt to shock Rome into submission to his will and his God? It's hard to say definitively, given the biased nature of the ancient sources, but what is clear is that his reign was a continuous, almost performance art-like assault on Roman sensibilities, with his silk garments as the constant, flowing backdrop. Every meal, every public appearance, every bizarre prank was another thread in the tapestry of his infamy, carefully woven from the most expensive silk and the most outlandish ideas. His feasts were not merely about eating, they were about power, provocation, and pure, unadulterated spectacle. And like many spectacles, they were both captivating and, ultimately, unsustainable. To understand Elagabalus's obsession with silk, you have to appreciate just how much of a luxury item it was in the Roman Empire. This wasn't some easily manufactured fabric you could pick up at your local market. Oh no, silk was the epitome of exotic wealth, a shimmering thread connecting Rome to the almost mythical lands of the Far East. For Elagabalus to wear it daily, and in such quantities, meant an economic footprint that was truly staggering. You're thinking, it's just clothes. How much could it cost? Well, buckle up, because we're about to delve into the ancient world's most exclusive supply chain. The journey of silk began primarily in China, a civilization so distant from Rome that direct contact was rare and almost certainly discouraged. By intermediaries, the Romans knew very little about where silk truly came from, often believing it grew on trees or was spun by giant beetles. This mystery only added to its allure and value. The famed Silk Road was not a single paved highway, but a vast, sprawling network of trade routes, a perilous, arduous journey stretching thousands of miles across deserts, mountains, and hostile territories. Imagine caravans of camels, donkeys, and horses, laden with precious bales of raw silk, spun thread, or finished fabric, slowly making their way across treacherous terrain. Each leg of the journey involved multiple middlemen, each taking their cut, from the Chinese merchants to the Sogdians in Central Asia, the Parthians, and later the Sasanian Persians, who controlled crucial stretches of the route, and finally to the Syrian and Egyptian traders who brought it to the Mediterranean ports. The price of silk inflated exponentially with every mile. By the time it reached Rome, it was literally worth its weight in gold, sometimes even more. A single pound of silk could cost several hundred denarii, a sum equivalent to a legionary's annual salary or more. Now, imagine an emperor who never wore the same silk garment twice. The sheer volume of silk needed would have been immense. Consider the economics of this. For Elagabalus to maintain his daily fresh silk habit, the imperial treasury would have had to pour vast sums into acquiring this commodity. This wasn't just a one-off purchase. It was a continuous, almost endless demand. Imperial agents, procurators, and wealthy merchants would have been tasked with securing these shipments, navigating the complex trade networks, and dealing with the political instabilities of the empires along the Silk Road. The demand generated by the emperor alone could have significantly impacted the market, driving prices even higher. The logistics were mind-boggling for the time. How do you transport, literally, tons of silk across continents without it being damaged, stolen, or held for ransom? It required enormous security, diplomatic maneuvering, and vast capital investment. Each bolt of silk that arrived in Rome was a testament to a globalized economy, albeit one operating at a snail's pace and under immense risk. And for Elagabalus, every shimmering thread was a statement of his ultimate wealth and disregard for conventional cost. This immense cost and effort were well known in Rome, which only further fueled the Senate's outrage. While they understood the need for imperial pomp, this level of personal luxury, especially for a single fabric, seemed utterly frivolous and wasteful. The Roman elite, though wealthy, still paid lip service to a certain degree of frugality and common sense. Elagabalus's silk obsession was seen as a sign of his boundless extravagance, a drain on public funds that could have been used for more pressing imperial matters, like maintaining the legions or building infrastructure. You remember those roads and aqueducts we talked about? Well, funding for those might have just gone into another one of Elagabalus's tunics, beyond the raw material. There was the additional cost of craftsmanship. Silk was often woven into intricate patterns, dyed with rare and expensive pigments, think Tyrian purple. Another hugely costly dye, and sometimes embroidered with gold or silver thread. The skill required for such fine work was considerable, and these artisans would have commanded high prices. The imperial vestiarium, the emperor's personal wardrobe department, would have been a massive operation, employing legions of tailors, seamstresses, dyers, and laundry staff, all dedicated to maintaining Elagabalus's impossibly demanding silk supply. It wasn't just his own wardrobe. As we discussed, he reportedly adorned his palace with silk hangings, silk cushions, and silk drapes. His chariots, his litters, even the collars for his exotic pets were rumored to be made of, or trimmed with, silk. He surrounded himself in a cocoon of the luxurious fabric, creating a physical manifestation of his disregard for economic sense and Roman restraint. This widespread use amplified the demand and the cost, making his silk habit an economic force in itself. One mainstream historical fact to consider is that the flow of luxury goods, including silk, from the East was a constant source of concern for Roman economic thinkers. There was a perpetual trade deficit with the East, Rome sent vast amounts of gold and silver eastward in exchange for these exotic products. This drain of specie was seen by many as detrimental to the Roman economy. Elagabalus, with his insatiable demand for silk, simply accelerated this perceived drain, turning a significant economic issue into a personal indulgence. This would have been another point of frustration for the Senate and financially minded advisors. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to the silk economy is the Roman Senate's attempt, at various times, to ban or restrict the wearing of silk by men, precisely because of its perceived effeminacy and excessive cost. These sumptuary laws were rarely effective, but they demonstrate the prevailing Roman attitude towards silk. For Elagabalus, an emperor, to not only flout these social norms, but to make silk his signature garment was a defiant act. It was as if he was personally challenging the economic and moral sensibilities of the entire Roman establishment. Historians still argue whether the scale of Elagabalus's reported extravagance was truly unique, or if the ancient sources simply exaggerated his excesses to fit a narrative of imperial degeneracy. While other emperors certainly indulged in luxuries, Elagabalus's singular focus on silk and the sheer reported volume of it does suggest a level of obsession that stands out. Was he merely a product of an already opulent imperial culture, or did he actively push the boundaries of what was considered acceptable? It's a fascinating debate. Regardless, his legacy is inextricably linked to the economic impact of his silken demands. The Roman silk economy, already a niche but lucrative segment of international trade, became, under Elagabalus, a direct pipeline to the imperial treasury, diverting vast sums of wealth for purely personal aesthetic reasons. It was a testament to his unchecked power and his complete indifference to the financial well-being of the empire as long as his next shimmering outfit was ready. The delicate, beautiful threads of silk, which had traveled thousands of miles, carried with them not just the scent of the East, but the scent of mounting imperial debt and simmering Roman resentment. This was an emperor whose fashion choices were not just a visual statement, but an economic policy, and one that further cemented his reputation as a ruler completely out of touch with the realities of his vast domain. As if his silk-drenched wardrobe and extravagant feasts weren't enough to alienate the Roman establishment, Elagabalus embarked on an even more ambitious and ultimately disastrous project, a wholesale reform of Roman religion. This wasn't just about building a temple or introducing a new god. It was an attempt to fundamentally reshape the spiritual landscape of the empire, and in doing so, to place his foreign sun god, Elagabal, at its absolute apex. You might think religious reform sounds like a lofty goal, but for the Romans, it felt like an existential threat, a deliberate undermining of the very gods who had, for centuries, protected their city and their empire from the moment he entered Rome. Elagabalus made it clear that his personal deity was to be supreme. The sacred black stone, the beetle of Elagabal, was installed not just in any temple, but initially, controversially, in the venerable temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, on the Capitoline Hill. This was an unthinkable act of sacrilege to traditional Romans. Jupiter, the king of the gods, the embodiment of Roman state religion, was effectively demoted, forced to share his sacred space with a foreign conical rock. Imagine the uproar if such a thing happened in a modern, deeply religious society. It was a direct, spiritual affront, a signal that the old order was to be swept aside. This initial act was swiftly followed by the relentless construction of the Elagabalus on the Palatine Hill. This temple was not just a place of worship. It was intended as the new spiritual heart of Rome, dwarfing existing structures and serving as a permanent monument to Elagabalus, and by extension, Elagabalus's supremacy. He personally presided over daily rituals there, dressed in his shimmering silk priestly robes, performing ceremonies that were utterly alien to Roman sensibilities. These included ecstatic dances, foreign music, and chants, all designed to evoke the mystical, frenzied atmosphere of his Syrian cult. Romans, accustomed to more sober, formal rituals, found these displays bewildering and often scandalous. But Elagabalus's religious ambition didn't stop at building a grand temple. He sought to create a true monotheistic, or at least henotheist, meaning the worship of one god without denying the existence of others, cult of Elagabalus, where all other Roman deities would be subservient. This was perhaps the most radical and offensive aspect of his religious reforms. He ordered that all sacred objects from other Roman cults, including the venerable Palladium, a statue of Pallas Athena, believed to protect Rome, the sacred shields of the Salii priests, and even the sacred fire of Vesta, be brought and housed within the Elagabalus. The idea was to collect all sources of divine power and focus them under the umbrella of Elagabalus, thereby asserting his god's ultimate dominion. Think of the impact this had on Roman priests and cults. Their ancient traditions, their sacred objects, their very identities were being systematically undermined and absorbed by a foreign cult. It was a hostile takeover of their spiritual heritage. The Vestal Virgins, for example, were not only scandalized by the emperor's personal antics, but by the direct attack on their goddess Vesta, whose sacred fire was now housed in the temple of a foreign god. This was not simply interfaith dialogue. It was a forced conversion of the very fabric of Roman religion. His infamous marriages of his god were another layer of this religious restructuring. First, the forced symbolic marriage of Elagabalus to the Vestal Virgin Aquilia Severa. This was a grotesque violation of Roman religious law and tradition, a profound sacrilege. It was designed to link the most sacred Roman institution, the Vestals, directly to his foreign cult, forcing acceptance through a perverse form of divine union. Later, he seemingly found a more suitable divine consort in Urania Astarte, a prominent goddess from Carthage, further attempting to establish a pannier, Eastern divine supremacy for Elagabalus. Historians still argue whether this was a true theological progression or simply Elagabalus's capricious nature at play. Was he genuinely seeking a universal religion, or just satisfying his peculiar whims? One mainstream historical fact is that the Roman Empire was generally tolerant of foreign cults, provided they did not threaten public order or undermine Roman authority. This policy of religious syncretism allowed many foreign gods to be worshipped in Rome alongside the traditional pantheon. However, Elagabalus's approach was not one of inclusion but of subjugation. He was not adding Elagabalus to the pantheon. He was attempting to make Elagabalus the only god that truly mattered, effectively demoting all others. This aggressive proselytization was unprecedented and deeply alarming to the Roman religious establishment. A quirky or fringe tidbit is the alleged practice of daily animal sacrifices, often of immense numbers of cattle and sheep at the Elagabalus. These grand sacrifices were performed by Elagabalus himself, often dressed in his elaborate silk robes, and involved foreign rituals, including the collection of blood in golden vessels. While animal sacrifice was common in Roman religion, the sheer scale and the foreign nature of these rituals, combined with rumors of human sacrifice, though this is likely propaganda, horrified many Romans. It was seen as barbaric and un-Roman, further cementing his image as an alien tyrant. The political implications of these religious reforms were immense. By alienating the traditional religious institutions and the powerful priestly colleges, Elagabalus was eroding another pillar of his imperial support. Religion in Rome was inextricably linked to the state. An attack on one was an attack on the other. The Senate, already seething over his extravagance and effeminacy, found his religious fanaticism even more abhorrent. They saw it as a threat to the very stability of the empire, a divinely ordained order that had brought Rome its power and glory. The military, too, was uncomfortable. While many legionaries were superstitious and worshipped various gods, including Eastern deities, the idea of their emperor forcing them to abandon their traditional military gods and swear fealty to a conical black stone was unsettling. Their loyalty was to Rome, to its emperor, and to its ancestral customs, not to the exotic cult of Emesa. This relentless religious push, coupled with his increasingly bizarre personal behavior and lavish spending on silk and other luxuries, painted a picture of an emperor completely detached from the realities of governance and the sensibilities of his subjects. He was not governing. He was performing an unending religious drama, with himself as the central, silk-clad protagonist. His decrees often prioritized the cult of Elagabalus above all else, from the imperial coinage, which now often featured the black stone, to the seating arrangements at public events, where the stone would often occupy the most honored spot. Historians still argue whether Elagabalus's religious reforms were a sincere, if misguided, attempt to unify the diverse empire under a single, powerful deity, or merely an expression of his personal megalomania, using religion as a tool for absolute control. Was he a true believer, or simply using the guise of piety to justify his excesses? The truth is elusive, buried under layers of hostile propaganda. However, the outcome is clear. His radical religious agenda, intertwined with his scandalous personal life and his obsession with silk, served only to further isolate him from the very people he sought to rule. He challenged too many traditions, too many sacred cows, and pushed the boundaries of Roman tolerance too far. The temple he so meticulously built for his god became, ironically, a monument to his downfall, a constant reminder of how far he had strayed from the path of a Roman emperor. If Elagabalus's religious reforms and silk-laden lifestyle weren't enough to scandalize Rome, his marital choices certainly pushed many over the edge. Roman imperial marriages were, first and foremost, political alliances designed to solidify power, create heirs, and foster stability. They were rarely about love or personal preference, and certainly not about serial, unconventional, and often illegal unions. Elagabalus, however, treated marriage with the same cavalier disregard for tradition that he applied to everything else. turning his love life into yet another source of public outrage and private disgust. You might think, oh, a bit of imperial romance. But this was less romance and more reality TV, ancient Roman style, with far more at stake than just ratings. His first significant marriage was, as we touched upon, to Julia Cornelia Paula. This was a fairly conventional match, arranged by his powerful grandmother, Julia Missa, to provide him with a respectable Roman wife and produce legitimate heirs. Paula was from a distinguished senatorial family, a symbol of continuity and tradition. You can imagine the relief among the Roman elite. Finally, a proper empress. Perhaps this boy will settle down. But this sense of calm was fleeting, like a whisper of silk on the wind. Elagabalus divorced Paula within a year. Why? Because he claimed he found a more suitable match, one that perfectly encapsulated his bizarre worldview and his relentless pursuit of sacrilege, the Vestal Virgin, Aquilia Severa. Remember the Vestal Virgins, sworn to chastity, dedicated to Vesta, the goddess of the hearth, for 30 years. Their purity was paramount to the safety and prosperity of Rome. To violate a Vestal Virgin was a capital crime, punishable by being buried alive. To marry one, let alone force her into marriage, was an act of profound blasphemy and state sacrilege. Elagabalus's justification for this unprecedented union was predictably religious. He declared that his god, Elagabal, needed a consort, and who better than a Vestal Virgin, a priestess herself, whose divine purity would somehow elevate his own god. It was a twisted logic that utterly disregarded Roman law and religious custom. Imagine the horror among the Roman populace and, especially, the Senate. This wasn't just a personal scandal. It was an act of treason against the very gods of Rome. Historians still argue whether his decision to marry Aquilia Severa was born of genuine religious fanaticism, a calculated attempt to fuse his cult with the most sacred Roman institutions, or simply an act of supreme adolescent defiance designed to provoke and shock. Perhaps all three, simmering in the mind of a young emperor with unchecked power. This marriage, forced upon Aquilia Severa, was a national scandal. It showed Elagabalus's contempt for legal and religious norms, and his willingness to use his absolute power to violate the most sacred tenets of Roman society. His silk robes, which he wore during the ceremony, would have seemed even more outrageous, a symbol of the effeminate foreign influence that was corrupting Roman virtue. He was marrying a priestess of Rome while dressed as a priest of Syria. The symbolism was not lost on anyone, but Elagabalus's marital escapades were far from over. He soon divorced Aquilia Severa, ostensibly because his god preferred a different consort. His next wife was a wealthy widow named Aeneia Faustina, a direct descendant of the revered emperor Marcus Aurelius. This marriage was likely another attempt by his grandmother, Julia Missa, to bring some semblance of legitimacy and stability to his chaotic reign, linking him to a more traditional, respected imperial line. For a brief moment, Rome might have breathed another sigh of relief. Good, he's back to politically sound matches. Maybe he's learned his lesson. Not a chance. After a very short time, Elagabalus divorced Aeneia Faustina too, and, in a move that truly beggared belief, he remarried Aquilia. This bizarre back and forth demonstrated a level of capriciousness and instability that shocked even the jaded Romans. It showed a complete disregard for the sanctity of marriage and for the political alliances it was supposed to cement. It was a carousel of empresses, each one dismissed as quickly as she was acquired, all for reasons that seemed utterly unfathomable to anyone grounded in Roman tradition. And then there were his numerous male relationships. Elagabalus was openly bisexual, a fact that, while perhaps not entirely unheard of in Rome, was certainly not something an emperor was expected to parade with such brazenness. He reportedly married a charioteer named Heracles, whom he elevated to an unprecedented level of power, and referred to him as his husband. He also married a slave named Zeuxis. These were not just casual dalliances. These were public, formal unions, complete with ceremonies, and further blurred the lines of Roman gender roles and sexual norms. He would even allegedly parade through Rome, seeking out male prostitutes, offering himself to them. This was an emperor, the chief magistrate, the military commander, debasing himself in the eyes of his subjects. A quirky or fringe tidbit is the anecdote, probably fabricated but widely believed, that Elagabalus would ask his physicians to perform a sex change operation on him. So desperate was he to become a woman. While the medical capabilities for such a procedure didn't exist then, the very rumor speaks to the perception of his perceived effeminacy and gender fluidity, which was deeply unsettling to the Roman patriarchal society. Historians still argue whether his gender expression was a genuine manifestation of his personal identity or a form of deliberate, extreme provocation designed to further shock and dismantle Roman norms. The sources are so heavily biased against him that separating fact from malicious rumor is incredibly difficult. These marital scandals and his open sexual relationships had profound consequences. They alienated the Senate, who saw him as morally corrupt and unfit to rule. They disgusted the common people, who, while perhaps not puritanical, still held strong beliefs about traditional family values and public decency. They undermined the authority of the emperor, reducing the highest office in the empire to a vehicle for personal gratification and bizarre experimentation. The Praetorian Guard, whose loyalty was crucial for any emperor, also began to grow restless. They were paid well, yes, but they also expected their emperor to embody Roman virtues and maintain order. Elagabalus's constant scandals, his disregard for tradition, and his increasingly erratic behavior created an atmosphere of instability and embarrassment. Their leader was seen as a laughingstock, an effeminate priest more interested in silk and sex than in ruling the empire. His mother, Julia Suamius, and particularly his grandmother, Julia Misa, who had engineered his rise to power, must have been tearing their hair out. They had put him on the throne to secure their family's power to continue the Severan dynasty. Instead, he was systematically dismantling everything they had worked for, turning their carefully crafted legitimacy into a public farce. They tried to control him, to guide him, but his obstinacy and single-minded pursuit of his own desires seemed unshakable. The constant upheaval in his personal life, particularly his fleeting marriages, meant that the crucial matter of succession remained unresolved. He had no legitimate, universally accepted heir, which created a dangerous power vacuum and invited further instability. This was a critical failure of his imperial duty, and one that his shrewd grandmother would eventually move to rectify by cultivating a different, more traditionally Roman heir, his cousin, Severus Alexander. Elagabalus's marital scandals and sexual escapades, therefore, were not just trivial personal matters. They were deeply intertwined with his religious reforms, his lavish lifestyle, and his silk obsession, all contributing to a growing tide of discontent that would eventually overwhelm him. His private life, lived so publicly and so defiantly against Roman norms, became yet another nail in his imperial coffin, each scandalous union tightening the noose around his silk-clad neck. While the focus on Elagabalus often gravitates towards his silk wardrobe, his outlandish feasts, and his scandalous marriages, he wasn't entirely devoid of more conventional imperial activities. Even an emperor, consumed by religious fervor and personal indulgence, still had to engage, however briefly, with the practicalities of governing a vast empire. Yet, even in his architectural whims and administrative decisions, Elagabalus managed to inject a distinct flavor of his unique personality, often blending the practical with the peculiar. You might think of emperors commissioning grand public works for the benefit of their citizens. Elagabalus, on the other hand, often seemed to build for his god, or for his own bizarre amusement, the most significant of his architectural endeavors, as you remember, was the Elagabalus on the Palatine Hill. This was no minor project. It was a massive undertaking, demanding significant resources, skilled labor, and constant attention. While we've discussed its religious significance, it also represented a monumental investment in construction. Imagine the quarries humming, the ships bringing in marble from distant lands, the legions of slaves and free laborers toiling under the Roman sun. This was a testament to imperial power, even if that power was channeled into a deeply unconventional purpose. The sheer scale of the Elagabalus, designed to overshadow all other temples, clearly demonstrated his ambition to physically manifest his god's supremacy over Rome. It was, in its own way, a public work, but one dedicated to a single, foreign deity rather than the traditional pantheon or the needs of the Roman people. Beyond the Elagabalus, ancient sources mention other, perhaps lesser-known, building projects and design eccentricities that highlight his peculiar tastes. One rather curious tidbit, possibly apocryphal but endlessly repeated, involves his fondness for constructing mobile towers or revolving dining rooms. Imagine a dining room that slowly spun, offering different views of the Roman landscape, or perhaps simply adding to the dizzying sensory overload of his feasts. While such structures might seem impossible with ancient technology, Roman engineers were remarkably capable, and the desire for novelty certainly spurred innovation. If true, it speaks volumes about his desire for constant stimulation and his willingness to commission engineering marvels purely for personal entertainment rather than public utility. It's the ancient equivalent of having a fully automated smart home, but with lions and flower bombs. He also apparently had a passion for hydraulic engineering, but again with a twist. While Roman emperors typically built aqueducts to supply clean water to the populace, Elagabalus was reportedly interested in creating elaborate water features for his private villas and gardens, sometimes even attempting to create artificial lakes in unusual locations. There are accounts of him trying to flood certain areas within the city for boat races or aquatic displays, which, as you can imagine, caused considerable disruption and annoyance to the residents. This wasn't about improving sanitation. It was about spectacle. One mainstream historical fact regarding imperial building projects is that they were often a way for emperors to gain popular support, leave a lasting legacy, and provide employment for the urban poor. Think of the Colosseum or Trajan's Forum. Elagabalus's building projects, however, seemed primarily self-serving or deity-serving, rather than genuinely benefiting the Roman populace. While the construction of the Elagabalus certainly created jobs, its ultimate purpose alienated more people than it pleased. This disconnect between imperial spending and public benefit was another source of frustration for those who watched the imperial treasury being drained. His administrative decisions also displayed a mixture of eccentricity and occasional, almost accidental, good sense. For instance, he reportedly made an effort to improve the quality of the coinage, though this was primarily to feature images of his god, Elagabalus, and himself as his high priest. So, while the coins might have been better struck, their iconography was still a constant reminder of his religious obsession. He also, at times, involved women in the imperial court in a way that was unprecedented. His mother and grandmother, Julia Soaemias and Julia Mista, wielded immense power behind the scenes, effectively running much of the empire. But Elagabalus also established a Senate of Women, a formal body where Roman matrons reportedly discussed matters of etiquette, fashion, and social decorum. This quirky tidbit, while seemingly progressive, was also seen by many Roman men as a further sign of his subversion of traditional gender roles and his general frivolousness. While Rome burns, the women discuss hemlines. You can almost hear them lamenting. This Senate of Women, often referred to as the Conventus Matronarum, was a source of great mockery for ancient historians. While it provided an unprecedented platform for elite Roman women, it was portrayed as a trivial assembly focused on petty concerns, and further proof of the emperor's effeminate leanings. The idea that women would hold any formal advisory role, even on social matters, was an affront to the patriarchal structure of Roman society. Historians still argue whether this assembly was a genuine attempt to empower women, however superficially, or simply another bizarre whim of an emperor who delighted in appending norms. Given his general disregard for traditional governance, the latter seems more probable. He also had a curious habit of appointing people to high office based on their physical attributes or their skills in entertaining him, rather than their administrative competence or senatorial experience. He reportedly appointed a charioteer to a high political position simply because he was a good driver. This kind of arbitrary decision-making further destabilized the bureaucracy and alienated the experienced civil servants and ambitious members of the Roman elite who believed in meritocracy, or at least inherited status. His general approach to governance was marked by inconsistency. One day, he might issue a decree on a minor administrative matter. The next, he might be completely absorbed in a religious ritual or a decadent banquet. This erratic behavior made it difficult for anyone around him to predict his actions or to effectively manage the empire. The actual day-to-day running of the state often fell to his grandmother, Julia Misa, and his more conventional cousin, Severus Alexander, who was being groomed for a more traditional role. This created a clear contrast in leadership styles, a contrast that would ultimately prove fatal for Elagabalus, even in his military decisions. His personal eccentricities sometimes shone through. While he didn't lead major campaigns, he would occasionally review the troops. Imagine him arriving, not in armor, but in his flowing silks, perhaps perfumed, observing grizzled legionaries who lived and died by the sword. This incongruity would have been stark and perhaps even demoralizing. The military, the backbone of Roman power, generally preferred their emperors to be soldiers themselves, or at least to project a strong martial image. Elagabalus projected the image of a priest-performer, more at home in a temple or a banquet hall than on a battlefield. His architectural and administrative whims, therefore, were not isolated incidents, but part of a larger pattern of behavior that consistently defied Roman expectations. He built grand temples for his god, not just for the public good. He explored novel engineering, but for personal amusement. He elevated the unconventional and trivialized the traditional. His very presence, always shimmering in silk, was a constant visual reminder that even in the sober business of governance, he remained an outsider, an anomaly, a ruler whose priorities were utterly alien to the Roman mindset. These perceived failings in traditional imperial duties, combined with his constant stream of scandals, were slowly but surely eroding whatever fragile legitimacy he possessed. The boundless patience of the Praetorian Guard, much like the flow of silk, eventually runs out. While the Senate fumed in their marble halls and the populace whispered in the forum, it was ultimately the loyalty of the Praetorian Guard, the elite imperial bodyguard, that determined an emperor's fate. And for Elagabalus, his increasingly bizarre reign, coupled with his persistent affronts to Roman dignity, began to fray even their formidable discipline. You might think of these guards as mere muscle, but they were a powerful political force, a king-making and king-breaking institution, and their discontent was the most dangerous kind. The Praetorian Guard was the emperor's immediate protection, his most loyal and most dangerous servants. They were well paid, highly privileged, and often held immense sway in imperial succession. Their barracks were right in Rome, and their proximity to the emperor meant they witnessed his daily life, his eccentricities, and his escalating follies firsthand. Imagine a Praetorian centurion, a grizzled veteran of campaigns, standing guard as the emperor glides past, not in military regalia, but in shimmering silk, perhaps with painted eyes. How do you maintain respect for a commander who seems more interested in exotic banquets and priestly dances than military matters? Initially, the Guard had been instrumental in elevating Elagabalus to power, swayed by the propaganda of Julia Misa and the promise of a stable Severan rule. They saw him as Caracalus' son, a continuation of a line they were loyal to, but their loyalty was conditional. It was based on the expectation that the emperor would uphold Roman values, maintain the legion's prestige, and, crucially, deliver steady pay and donatives bonuses. Elagabalus, while showering them with money at first, increasingly failed. On the other two counts, his religious reforms were a particular source of discomfort. While many soldiers had their own personal cults, the aggressive promotion of Elagabalus, the denigration of traditional Roman gods, and the emperor's personal participation in bizarre, effeminate rituals deeply unsettled them. Soldiers preferred a strong, martial emperor who worshipped the gods of war and victory, not a priest king who danced in silk before a black stone. the sight of the sacred beal being paraded through the city, even taking precedence over military standards, would have been deeply unsettling to their professional pride and religious sensibilities. A mainstream historical fact is that the military, particularly the Praetorian Guard, often had conservative social values and a strong adherence to traditional Roman religious practices, especially those related to military success. Elagabalus's actions were a direct challenge to this. His lavish spending, while it initially translated into generous donatives, quickly became a point of resentment. The Guard, like the Senate, would have observed the imperial treasury being drained on silk, exotic food, and peculiar architectural projects rather than on military infrastructure or additional pay for the far-flung legions. They saw the emperor squandering resources on personal whims while the empire faced real threats on its borders. An emperor who wastes money on parrot tongues and silk cloaks instead of fortifying a frontier camp is not an emperor who inspires confidence. Perhaps most critically, Elagabalus's perceived effeminacy and sexual scandals were an enormous affront to the deeply ingrained Roman concept of masculinity, which was particularly strong within the military. Roman soldiers valued strength, discipline, and a certain ruggedness. Elagabalus, with his reported makeup, elaborate hairstyles, and constant wearing of silk, seemed to embody the very opposite of these ideals. His public marriages to male partners and his alleged escapades in Rome's taverns and brothels were not just personal choices. They were an embarrassment to the Guard, who were sworn to protect the dignity of the imperial office. How could they respect and fight for a man who, in their eyes, acted like a common prostitute or a decadent Eastern potentate? It was an insult to their soldierly honor. A quirky or fringe tidbit illustrates the Praetorian Guard's growing exasperation. It's rumored that on one occasion, when Elagabalus was parading in one of his most flamboyant silk outfits, some of the more conservative guardsmen deliberately averted their gaze or made comments under their breath. A subtle but significant act of defiance. An emperor's sartorial choices, normally a source of imperial splendor, had become a source of ridicule and shame for his own personal Guard. The continuous scandals also created an atmosphere of instability within the palace. The frequent changes of empresses, the elevation of obscure favorites to positions of power, and the emperor's increasingly erratic behavior meant that no one felt secure. The Praetorians, who often benefited from a stable imperial line, preferred a predictable ruler. Elagabalus was anything but predictable. This uncertainty eroded their loyalty and made them more receptive to alternatives. Julia Maesa, Elagabalus's astute grandmother, recognized this growing discontent. She saw the writing on the wall, or rather, the silk on the emperor. Her original plan to secure the Severan dynasty through Elagabalus was backfiring spectacularly. He was not only alienating the Senate and the populace, but, more dangerously, the military. She knew she needed a backup plan, a way to salvage the family's power and ensure their survival. This realization led her to turn to Elagabalus's cousin, his polar opposite in almost every way. Marcus Aurelius Severus Alexander, who had been raised much more traditionally, was being carefully groomed by Julia Maesa. He was presented as a young man of sober habits, respectful of Roman customs, and, crucially, free from the taint of Elagabalus's exotic cult and his silk obsession. He was everything Elagabalus was not: Roman, modest, and seemingly earnest. This deliberate contrast made him an attractive alternative for the increasingly frustrated Praetorian Guard. Elagabalus, however, was not entirely oblivious to the threat his cousin posed. He saw the growing popularity of Alexander, especially among the Guard, and reportedly grew jealous and paranoid. He made several attempts to undermine Alexander, even trying to revoke his titles and have him removed from public view. But by this point, Alexander had built up too much support, particularly within the military ranks. Julia Maesa had played her cards brilliantly, securing Alexander's position by having the Senate grant him the title of Caesar, effectively designating him as heir. These attempts to sideline Alexander only further inflamed the Praetorian Guard. They saw it as a threat to a promising, more Roman successor, and another example of Elagabalus's irrationality. The final straw likely came when Elagabalus ordered the assassination of some of Alexander's closest associates, a move that directly threatened Alexander himself and, by extension, Julia Maesa's carefully laid plans. The Guard, fearing for their own safety and for the future of the Severan dynasty as they envisioned it, decided that Elagabalus had become too much of a liability. Historians still argue whether the Praetorian Guard's discontent was primarily driven by social and moral outrage over Elagabalus's lifestyle, or more pragmatic concerns about imperial stability and their own economic interests. It was likely a potent blend of both: the constant spectacle of an emperor in silk, indulging in what they considered effeminate and sacrilegious behavior, certainly chipped away at their respect, making it easier for them to contemplate drastic action when combined with concerns about their pay and the overall direction of the empire. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's supposedly loyal protectors, had finally had enough of the silk and scandal. Their patience, a quality not known for its abundance within their ranks, had been exhausted. They were weary of the constant embarrassment, the bizarre rituals, and the utter disregard for Roman tradition. The stage was set for a violent resolution, a swift end to the reign of the silk-clad emperor, engineered by the very men who had once placed him on the throne. As the Praetorian Guard's patience thinned, a new figure, meticulously cultivated by the cunning Julia Maesa, began to cast an increasingly long shadow over the silk-draped reign of Elagabalus. This was his cousin, Marcus Aurelius Severus Alexander, a young man who was, in almost every conceivable way, the antithesis of the flamboyant emperor. You can imagine the tension in the imperial palace, a palpable sense of two vastly different worlds colliding, one shimmering in exotic silk, the other grounded in traditional Roman wool. Alexander was the son of Julia Mamaea, Julia Maesa's other daughter. Unlike Elagabalus, who had been raised in the priestly confines of Emesa, Alexander was carefully groomed from a young age to embody Roman virtues. Julia Maesa, having learned a bitter lesson with her first imperial grandson, was determined to get it right this time. Alexander was educated by the finest Roman tutors, steeped in classical literature, rhetoric, and military arts. He was taught to be respectful of Roman traditions, to revere the old gods, and to project an image of sober dignity. He wore the traditional toga, he participated in Roman festivals, and he cultivated an aura of gravitas that was utterly lacking in his cousin. He was, in essence, the Roman candidate, the reassuringly familiar face in a court that had become alarmingly foreign. Julia Misa orchestrated Alexander's rise with the precision of a master strategist. She knew that simply replacing Elagabalus wouldn't be enough. There needed to be a legitimate, accepted successor. In 221 AD, she persuaded Elagabalus to adopt Alexander as his son and heir, and to grant him the title of Caesar. This was a brilliant move. It provided Alexander with immediate imperial legitimacy and placed him directly in the line of succession. You can almost hear the sighs of relief from the Senate and the Praetorian Guard, who saw in Alexander a glimmer of hope for a return to normalcy. Finally, they might have thought, a proper Roman will inherit the purple, and perhaps we can get back to boring, stable governance. Elagabalus, surprisingly, initially agreed to this arrangement. Perhaps he was still under the influence of his formidable grandmother, or perhaps he genuinely believed it would solidify his own position by providing an uncontroversial heir. But it wasn't long before his deep-seated paranoia and jealousy began to surface. As Alexander's popularity soared, particularly among the Praetorian Guard, Elagabalus grew increasingly resentful. The contrast between them was stark. While Elagabalus continued his daily routine of bizarre rituals, decadent feasts, and changing into countless silk outfits, Alexander was reportedly diligent, modest, and dedicated to his studies and martial training. He was, in short, everything the Roman establishment desired in an emperor, and everything Elagabalus was not. The Praetorian Guard, in particular, flocked to Alexander. They saw in him the promise of stability, of traditional Roman leadership, and of an emperor who would uphold their values and pay them reliably. Alexander, in turn, cultivated their loyalty, treating them with respect and listening to their concerns. A stark contrast to Elagabalus, who often treated them as mere props in his theatrical displays. The whisper campaign, initially subtle, grew louder. This Alexander, he is truly Roman. He respects the gods. He wears proper clothes. He would be a true emperor. Elagabalus, in a fit of pique and fear, made several attempts to undermine Alexander's position. He tried to revoke his titles, to ban him from public appearances, even, according to some sources, to have him assassinated. These attempts, however, backfired spectacularly. The Praetorian Guard, by now fiercely loyal to Alexander, refused to comply. In fact, they rallied around Alexander, demonstrating their unwavering support. Imagine the scene: Elagabalus giving an order, perhaps dressed in a particularly vibrant silk tunic, and his own elite guard, the very men sworn to obey, him defiantly refusing, turning their backs, their faces set in grim disapproval. The tables had well and truly turned. A mainstream historical fact is that this open defiance by the Praetorian Guard was a clear indication that Elagabalus had lost control. Their loyalty was paramount, and once it fractured, an emperor's days were numbered. The fact that Julia Misa was still alive and actively orchestrating this shift in power made the situation even more precarious for Elagabalus. She was effectively pitting one grandson against the other, ensuring the survival of her family's dynasty, even if it meant sacrificing the one who had strayed too far. One quirky or fringe tidbit from this period describes Elagabalus becoming so enraged by Alexander's popularity that he reportedly tried to instigate a public riot against his cousin. He allegedly tried to have false rumors spread about Alexander's health, hoping to incite a panicked reaction from the populace. The Praetorian Guard, however, intervened, refusing to allow such a destabilizing act and further solidifying their protective stance over Alexander. It was a clear sign that Elagabalus's authority had almost completely evaporated. He could no longer even rely on his own propaganda machine to function as he wished. Historians still argue whether Elagabalus was truly unaware of the depth of the Praetorian Guard's loyalty to Alexander, or if his paranoia simply blinded him to the inevitable consequences of his actions. Was he so consumed by his own religious zeal and hedonistic lifestyle that he couldn't see the approaching storm? Or did he simply underestimate the resolve of his grandmother and the loyalty Alexander had cultivated? It's a testament to his isolation, perhaps, that he failed to grasp the mortal danger he was in, even as his own guards openly defied him. The climax of this dangerous sibling rivalry came when Elagabalus, desperate to assert his fading authority, ordered the Praetorian Guard to execute several prominent senators and officers who were seen as supporters of Alexander. This was a fatal miscalculation. The Guard, instead of obeying, mutinied. They had had enough of the erratic orders, the constant scandals, and the perceived threat to Alexander. They saw Elagabalus as a liability, a threat to their own stability and privileges. The stage was set. The contrast between the two cousins, one surrounded by the opulence of silk and the bizarre rituals of his god, the other quietly building a network of support based on Roman tradition, was complete. Alexander was the embodiment of stability and hope for a return to normal imperial rule, while Elagabalus symbolized chaos, foreign influence, and moral decay. The die was cast, and the fate of the silk-wearing emperor was sealed. His continued insistence on his peculiar habits, his effeminacy, and his lack of traditional Roman virtues, all encapsulated by his unique wardrobe, had made him an intolerable figure to the very people he needed to govern. The Praetorian Guard, the ultimate arbiter of imperial power, was about to deliver their final, decisive judgment. The air in Rome, perpetually thick with the scent of spices, human endeavor, and perhaps the faint whiff of imperial desperation, now crackled with an undeniable tension. The standoff between Elagabalus and his increasingly popular cousin, Severus, Alexander, had reached its boiling point. The Praetorian Guard, the ultimate arbiter of imperial power, had made its choice, and it was not with the silk-clad priest-king. You could feel it in the hushed conversations, the anxious glances, the shifting loyalties among the palace staff. The stage was set for a dramatic, bloody conclusion, a spectacle that would tragically define the brief, bizarre reign of Elagabalus. The events that directly led to his downfall occurred in March of 222 AD. Elagabalus, in a desperate attempt to reassert his authority and perhaps to test the loyalty of the Praetorian Guard, ordered the arrest and execution of several individuals closely associated with Alexander. He was, in essence, drawing a line in the sand, demanding that the Guard choose between him and his cousin. This was a fatal miscalculation. The Praetorians, by this point, were firmly in Alexander's corner. Thanks to Julia Mace's shrewd maneuvering and Alexander's own traditional Roman demeanor, instead of complying with Elagabalus's order, the Praetorian Guard mutinied. This wasn't a subtle shift in allegiance. It was an open revolt. They refused to obey the emperor's commands and demanded to see Alexander, insisting on his protection. Imagine the scene within the Praetorian barracks, or perhaps even within the imperial palace itself. Soldiers, heavily armed, grim-faced, refusing to budge, their loyalty now unequivocally pledged to another. Elagabalus, probably still in one of his elaborate silk outfits, must have felt a cold dread creep over him. His divine mandate, his flowing robes, his absolute power, all suddenly felt very, very fragile. A mainstream historical fact is that the Praetorian Guard had a long history of making and breaking emperors. They were a mercenary force whose loyalty ultimately rested on their own perceived interests and the stability of the imperial office. When an emperor was seen as weak, unstable, or a threat to their privileges, they did not hesitate to act. Elagabalus had managed to tick all those boxes. The situation quickly escalated. Elagabalus, accompanied by his mother, Julia Soaemias, attempted to calm the mutinous guards. He reportedly tried to address them, perhaps with promises of more money or grand gestures. But his words, delivered by a youth whose credibility had long evaporated, fell on deaf ears. The guards were beyond persuasion. They wanted Alexander, and they wanted an end to the chaos that Elagabalus had brought upon Rome. This was not a negotiation. It was a demand. The turning point came when Elagabalus and Julia Soaemias were ordered into the Praetorian camp. Was a de facto arrest, a forced march into the heart of their discontent. Once inside, they were met not with respect, but with scorn and open hostility. The soldiers, now fully in control, dragged Elagabalus from his litter. The precious silks he so cherished, the symbols of his unique imperial identity, would have been torn, soiled, and rendered meaningless in the rough hands of his former protectors. The Empress, Julia Soaemias, reportedly clung to her son, trying to protect him, but her pleas were ignored. The exact details of Elagabalus's death are gruesome and heavily influenced by hostile ancient sources, eager to portray his demise as fittingly a quirky or fringe tidbit, often recounted. Claims that Elagabalus attempted to hide in a chest or a privy to escape his assassins, a final, pathetic act of desperation. Whether true or not, it serves to underscore the utter lack of dignity attributed to his end. He was found, dragged out, and brutally murdered by the Praetorian Guard. He was only 18 years old. His mother, Julia Soaemias, met the same fate, murdered. Alongside her son, her efforts to protect him utterly futile. The guards, in their rage, severed Elagabalus's head and, in a final act of contempt, paraded it through the streets of Rome on a spear. This was a common Roman practice for hated tyrants, a public display of vengeance, and a clear signal that the old order had been restored. The sight of the severed head of a Roman emperor, especially one so associated with flamboyant luxury, would have sent a chilling message throughout the city. But the indignities didn't end there. Elagabalus's body, stripped of its silks and tossed aside, was then reportedly dragged through the streets, subjected to public mutilation and mockery. The ultimate insult came when his corpse was thrown into the Tiber River. This was reserved for the most reviled criminals and tyrants, those deemed unworthy of even a proper burial. To deny a Roman emperor a proper burial was a profound act of damnation, erasing his presence from the very land he had once ruled. His silk-laden existence, so focused on appearance and luxury, ended in the most abject public humiliation. His very remains denied the dignity he had craved in life. With Elagabalus dispatched, the Praetorian Guard immediately proclaimed Severus Alexander as the new emperor. He was, by all accounts, a welcome change. The Senate, relieved by the removal of the troublesome Elagabalus, quickly ratified Alexander's accession. The black stone of Elagabal, the very symbol of the deposed emperor's religious obsession, was immediately removed from the Elagabalium and returned to Emesa, or perhaps simply put into storage. Its brief reign in Rome over the Grand Temple, meant to be a lasting monument to his god, was rededicated to Jupiter, or dismantled. Its controversial purpose obliterated, the memory of Elagabalus was officially condemned, a practice known as damnatio memoria. His name was struck from inscriptions, his statues were defaced or melted down, and his deeds were systematically demonized by subsequent historians, many of whom were hostile to his memory. This process ensured that his reign would be remembered as one of unparalleled depravity and folly, a cautionary tale for future emperors. His silk obsession, his religious fanaticism, his sexual antics, all were magnified and distorted to fit a narrative of un-Roman degeneracy. Historians still argue whether the extreme violence and public desecration of Elagabalus's body were a spontaneous eruption of popular and military anger, or if it was a calculated act orchestrated by Julia Misa and Alexander Xus to thoroughly discredit the previous regime and solidify the new one. Given the systematic nature of the damnatio memoria, it seems likely that there was a deliberate effort to erase his legitimate memory and replace it with a narrative of utter vilification. His death was not just an end to a reign, it was a deliberate extinguishing of a controversial memory, and so the reign of the Roman emperor who only wore silk came to an ignominious end. His life, so filled with color and extravagance, was cut short in a brutal public spectacle. His story serves as a stark reminder that in the volatile world of the Roman Empire, even absolute power could not withstand the combined forces of tradition, military discontent, and the cunning machinations of a determined grandmother. His silk wardrobe, once the symbol of his defiance and luxury, became, in its desecration and ultimate absence, the haunting symbol of his downfall. The whispers of scandal and the rustle of silk were finally silenced, replaced by the grim realities of Roman power. The dust of Elagabalus's ignominious end settled, and a new, more conventionally Roman emperor, Severus Alexander, took the reins. The elaborate silk garments that had been Elagabalus's signature were, naturally, banished. Rome, or at least its ruling elite, breathed a collective sigh of relief, eager to forget the un-Roman emperor. Yet, the legacy of silk, particularly in the context of Elagabalus, proved surprisingly tenacious, forever linking his name with extravagance, foreignness, and a peculiar kind of imperial folly. You might think that, after his damnatio, the official condemnation of his memory, where his name was chiseled from inscriptions and his images destroyed, Elagabalus would simply vanish from history, a mere footnote. But history, much like silk, has a way of clinging, of leaving indelible impressions. His obsession with the fabric, so shocking to his contemporaries, became one of the defining characteristics of his short, tumultuous reign. ensuring that he would be remembered, albeit negatively, for centuries to come. For the Romans, his silk habit became shorthand for everything they despised about him: his effeminacy, his perceived depravity, his contempt for tradition, and his alien religious fanaticism. When Roman historians, writing years or even decades after his death, recounted his story, the silk was always there, shimmering in the narrative, a constant visual cue for his perceived excesses. It wasn't just a detail, it was a symbol, a powerful metaphor for his un-Roman behavior. Think of how a single, striking image can define a public figure in modern times. For Elagabalus, that image was undeniably his silk. The very act of not wearing silk became a statement for subsequent emperors and the Roman elite. After Elagabalus, any display of excessive luxury, particularly in clothing, would have carried the unspoken stigma of his reign. It reinforced the idea that truly Roman emperors were sober, dignified, and practical in their attire, a clear contrast to the flamboyant youth who had so offended their sensibilities. The shadow of his silk-drenched reign, ironically, pushed Roman fashion, at least at the imperial level, back towards a more conservative aesthetic for a time. However, despite the official condemnation, silk itself did not disappear from Rome. Far from it. Its allure, its beauty, and its immense value ensured its continued presence in the Roman Empire. It remained a highly prized luxury item, sought after by the wealthy elite for special occasions, ceremonial wear, or as status symbols. It was worn by women, naturally, for its beauty, and by men in more private settings, or in garments that were less overtly effeminate than Elagabalus's flowing robes. The empire's insatiable appetite for luxury ensured the Silk Road remained a vital trade artery, even if the emperor himself no longer dictated its primary use. One mainstream historical fact is that Roman trade with the East, including for silk, continued for centuries after Elagabalus, evolving and adapting even after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The Byzantines, the Eastern Roman Empire, eventually even managed to acquire the secrets of sericulture silk production themselves, breaking the Chinese monopoly and making silk more accessible, though still a luxury. So, while Elagabalus's personal obsession was short-lived, the economic and cultural impact of silk on the Roman world persisted and even grew. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that even in the Byzantine Empire, centuries later, while silk was highly prized and worn by emperors and empresses, there remained a subtle undercurrent in some historical accounts that associated excessive, non-functional silkwear with a certain moral laxity, almost as a distant echo of the scandal surrounding the cultural memory of his reign, even if distorted, continued to influence perceptions of luxury and appropriate imperial conduct. It's like a faint, lingering scent of expensive perfume that refuses to entirely dissipate. Historians still argue whether Elagabalus's reign, despite its brevity and apparent madness, might have inadvertently contributed to a broader cultural shift towards integrating Eastern influences into Roman society. While his methods were certainly crude and often offensive, he was perhaps ahead of his time in recognizing the appeal of Eastern luxuries and religious practices. Did his radical experiment, even in its failure, open a small crack in the rigid Roman facade, allowing for future, more gradual assimilation of foreign elements? Or was he simply an aberration, a historical anomaly whose influence was primarily negative. The debate continues, offering a fascinating glimpse into the complexities of cultural change. The story of Elagabalus and his silk, then, is more than just a tale of a mad emperor and his clothes. It's a lens through which we can view the clash of cultures, the rigid conservatism of Roman society, the power of propaganda, and the enduring human fascination with luxury and spectacle. His reign was a brief, dazzling, and ultimately tragic blaze of color in the otherwise stoic tapestry of Roman history. He tried to force Rome to embrace his god, his customs, and his silk, and in doing so, he sealed his own fate. His legacy is not of a successful ruler, but of a cautionary tale, an emperor who served as a vivid example of what happened when absolute power was given to a youth utterly unmoored from tradition and consequence. The silk, in all its shimmering glory, became his enduring epitaph, a soft, flowing symbol of a hard, brutal lesson learned in the unforgiving arena of Roman politics. You remember that crocodile dung sunscreen we heard about in another story? That was just a practical absurdity. Elagabalus's silk was a deliberate, profound challenge to an entire civilization, and it ultimately cost him his life. And so, as we close this chapter on the emperor who only wore silk, you can almost hear the rustle of those magnificent, scandalous fabrics fading into the distant past. The Roman Empire moved on, but the story of Elagabalus, draped in his unforgettable silks, continued to whisper through the centuries, a reminder of the power of appearance, the dangers of hubris, and the enduring allure of luxury. Now, as the echoes of ancient Rome begin to recede, let your mind drift from the marble halls and bustling streets. Feel the gentle weight of your blankets, the soothing quiet of the night enveloping you. The long journey through this fascinating, if at times perplexing corner of history is drawing to a close. There's no need to cling to every detail, every fact. Just let the images soften, the names blur, as the edges of your awareness grow dim. The emperors and their silks, the gods and their stones, they all belong to a time far away. Their stories, now just a quiet hum in the vast, peaceful expanse of night. Allow yourself to sink deeper into the stillness, carrying only the faintest echo of a distant past. Your own dreams await, a tapestry woven just for you, far more comforting than any ancient silk. Just breathe slowly, deeply, and let yourself drift.